Keanu Reeves sacrifices his life to save a doctor from plane crash. The deafening roar of the engines was the last thing Keanu could hear before everything erupted into chaos. He had been flying back from a high-profile meeting, the kind that often had him traveling in luxury and comfort, but this time, things were different. He had just finished shaking hands with the important people on the other side of the world when the plane lurched violently, sending his stomach into his throat. The first signs of trouble. The oxygen masks dropped from overhead, and panic immediately gripped the passengers as the plane began its uncontrollable descent. Keanu's hands gripped the armrests of his seat as he looked around, taking in the fear in the eyes of the other passengers. The flight attendants were shouting, trying to maintain control, but there was no stopping the inevitable. The plane's descent had become too rapid, too violent. He turned his gaze to the window. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the wing begin to tear away. It wasn't just a malfunction. The engine had exploded, sending a burst of fire tearing through the fuselage. The smell of burning metal and electrical sparks filled the cabin. For the first time in his life, Keanu felt the true weight of his mortality. Through the panic and fear, he noticed something: a doctor. A man in a white coat who had been sitting a few rows ahead was struggling to help an injured passenger. Keanu's gaze locked with his for a moment, and for that split second, time seemed to slow. The doctor was trying to stay calm, holding a woman's hand, his voice steady as he tried to offer comfort in the midst of the storm. But the plane was falling too fast. The chaos intensified, and it became clear that no one was going to make it out of this unscathed. Then, something caught Keanu's eye. An emergency exit was ahead, but the impact from the rapid descent caused the emergency door to jam. The passengers were screaming in fear, trying to open it, but it wasn't budging. Keanu stood up from his seat, heart pounding, and scanned the cabin. It was then that he noticed the doctor once again, but this time, the doctor wasn't in the midst of helping someone. The doctor was scrambling for safety, like the rest of them. But there was a problem. The doctor had been separated from the group and was now stuck under a piece of debris. Instinct kicked in, and without thinking, Keanu rushed toward the doctor. His mind was racing, calculating the risks, but he didn't have the time to think it through. The plane was plunging rapidly toward the ground, and every second counted. He could hear the doctor's desperate calls for help, the sound of the wreckage ripping apart. Keanu reached the doctor just as the wall of the plane shifted. He grabbed the doctor's arm, yanking him from underneath the rubble, his own body flying forward as he shielded the doctor with his own body. But in that instant, the entire back of the plane was ripped away by an explosion. Keanu's breath caught in his throat as he pushed the doctor to safety, shielding him with his own body as the shockwave hit. The noise was deafening, and the force of the explosion pushed him back, knocking him off his feet. The doctor was gasping for air, disoriented from the blast. Keanu's body ached as he tried to stay conscious. His head was spinning, and the world around him was a blur. Despite the chaos that was all around him, one thing was clear. If he had stayed in his seat, if he hadn't acted, the doctor wouldn't have made it. But that wasn't the thought in Keanu's mind as the plane hurtled closer to the ground. His focus wasn't on himself or his own survival. It was on the people around him. On the doctor. On the woman the doctor had been helping. They needed to get out. As the plane began to break apart, Keanu felt a sharp pain in his chest as the cabin filled with smoke and debris. There was no way out. The doors were jammed. The windows were too small. There was no escape, only the sound of the plane's collapse around them. In the final moments, Keanu turned to the doctor one last time. His eyes locked with the doctor's, and despite the overwhelming fear, there was a sense of peace in that moment. A sense that he had done everything he could. The doctor nodded, as if he understood. There was no time to speak, no words to say. They were two men in the face of death, but Keanu's actions had spoken louder than any words could. He had chosen to sacrifice everything for the safety of another. And then the impact came. The world around Keanu went black. The world felt heavy, as if the very weight of life had been lifted off his chest. Keanu's eyes fluttered open slowly, the pain in his head overwhelming. His body was sore, every inch of him aching as if he had been thrown against concrete. He groaned, trying to push himself up, but everything felt wrong. For a moment, There was nothing but silence. The sound of the crash had faded, replaced by an eerie quiet. Keanu's eyes darted around. The plane had crashed, but somehow, he had survived. He wasn't sure how, but he was alive. His mind was foggy, his memories scattered. The only thing that felt real was the doctor beside him, unconscious but alive. He crawled toward the doctor, shaking him gently. "Hey, wake up!" The doctor groaned, his eyelids flickering. Slowly, the doctor opened his eyes and looked up at Keanu, confusion in his gaze. "We're alive," the doctor murmured, his voice hoarse. "How did we survive that?" Keanu smiled weakly, still in disbelief himself. "I don't know. But we're here. And that's all that matters." They both lay there, taking in their surroundings. The wreckage of the plane was everywhere. But somehow, against all odds, they had survived. As the dust settled, the two men helped each other stand, their legs shaky, their bodies battered, but their spirits unwavering. They had no idea how much time had passed, but the sound of distant voices reached their ears. There was hope yet. Keanu turned to the doctor. "Let's get out of here. We've got people to help." And with that, they moved toward the sound of rescue, both knowing that they had survived something far greater than a plane crash. They had survived because, in that moment, they had made a choice to save each other, no matter the cost. And as they stepped forward into the unknown, they knew one thing for certain: they had made a difference. The crackle of distant voices grew louder as Keanu and the doctor pushed through the debris, their steps unsteady, but determined. The pain in their bodies seemed to fade as their focus shifted. They had survived something no one could have predicted. Their immediate concern wasn't their injuries, it was the survivors, the people who hadn't been so lucky. Keanu's hand trembled slightly as he held onto the doctor's arm for support. "We've got to find the others." His voice was steady, but his heart raced. The doctor nodded, looking around the crash site with urgency. It was hard to make sense of the wreckage. Everything was broken, twisted metal, scattered debris, and remnants of the plane strewn about in every direction. The scent of smoke and fuel was thick in the air, and the sound of crackling fire filled the background. "We're going to need help," the doctor muttered, his brow furrowed with concern. He began to search through the wreckage, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Keanu took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he saw movement in the distance. He wasn't sure if it was a survivor or just the wind. His instincts told him to be cautious, but the urgency was overwhelming. "Stay close," Keanu said, pulling the doctor towards the source of the movement. They moved quickly, stepping over debris and around the broken remnants of the plane. As they neared the area, Keanu saw a figure lying in the dirt. His heart skipped a beat as he realized it was a woman, unconscious, but still alive. "She's breathing," Keanu exclaimed, rushing to her side. He gently checked for signs of life, feeling her pulse. The woman was alive, but her injuries were serious. Blood seeped from a wound on her forehead, and her legs were twisted at an unnatural angle. "We need to get her out of here." The doctor's voice was firm, as he took immediate action. "Help me. We have to stabilize her first." Keanu didn't hesitate. He pulled off his jacket and used it to apply pressure to the wound, while the doctor worked quickly to assess her condition. There was no time to waste. "It's a miracle we survived this," Keanu muttered as he looked down at the woman. "We can't let her die too." The doctor nodded grimly, his hands moving with practiced precision as he did everything he could to stabilize her. "She's lucky you found her. If you hadn't, she wouldn't have made it." Keanu didn't say anything. He simply focused on the task at hand, helping to carry the woman toward a safer part of the wreckage. They found an area of the wreckage that was more stable, a small clearing where they could tend to the survivors. As they laid the woman down, Keanu's mind raced. The crash had been a nightmare. He had been so focused on helping the doctor that he hadn't fully processed just how much had happened. The other survivors, if there were any, had to be found. The clock was ticking. "We need to check the perimeter," Keanu said, turning to the doctor. "We can't leave anyone behind." The doctor, now finished with the woman's initial care, agreed. "I'll stay here with her. You go. Find the others." Keanu nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. As much as he wanted to stay and help the woman, he knew the importance of finding the rest of the survivors. The wreckage was vast, and the risk of more explosions or fires spreading was high. They had to act quickly, or they would lose everyone. With his heart pounding in his chest, Keanu pushed forward, moving cautiously through the charred remains of the plane. His eyes darted to every corner, every twisted piece of metal. The forest beyond the wreckage was eerily quiet, but Keanu knew better than to assume it was safe. He had seen too much in his life to take anything for granted. Help! The shout came suddenly, breaking the silence. Keanu froze, instinctively moving toward the sound. "I'm here!" Keanu shouted back, sprinting toward the voice. He was met with another survivor, an older man, his clothes torn, but otherwise unscathed. He was struggling to free himself from the wreckage, his leg pinned under a large piece of metal. "Don't worry. I've got you," Keanu said as he quickly assessed the situation. The man was in pain, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. With all his strength, Keanu helped free the man's leg, pulling the debris away. The man gasped in relief, but there was no time to rest. "We need to move. There are more survivors. We've got to help them too," Keanu urged, his eyes scanning the wreckage once more. The man, still clutching his leg, nodded weakly. "I can walk. Help me." Together, they moved through the wreckage, working quickly to check on the remaining survivors. Some were severely injured, while others appeared to have escaped with only minor scrapes and bruises. Keanu and the doctor worked tirelessly, tending to wounds and comforting those in shock. After what felt like hours, they had managed to rescue everyone they could find. The survivors were all huddled together now, in the small area they had deemed as safe. Keanu couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Despite the odds, they had made it. But the work wasn't done. They still needed to get help. The remote location of the crash site made it unlikely that rescue teams would arrive anytime soon. Keanu turned to the doctor. "We need to find a way to get a message out. Can we fix the radio?" The doctor nodded, his expression grim. "We can try, but it's going to take time. We might be able to get a signal if we're lucky." Keanu didn't waste any more time. The survivors needed help, and they couldn't afford to wait around. He turned to the rest of the group. "We need to move. Find shelter, make fire, and stay together. We can't afford to get separated." The survivors nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Keanu could see the fear in their eyes, but there was a sense of determination too. They had made it this far and they weren't going to give up now. Keanu's mind raced as he directed the survivors to secure a safe spot. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on him, but he couldn't afford to show his fear. He had to be the rock, the steady hand guiding them through this nightmare. The survivors, mostly a mix of passengers and a few crew members, worked together under his direction. Some of them had injuries, while others were simply in shock. The crash had left them stranded in the middle of a forest, far from any kind of civilization. Keanu knew it was going to be a long time before help could arrive, if at all. "We need to get a signal out." The doctor's voice broke through his thoughts, his hands covered in dirt as he worked on the remains of the plane's communication system. "But this is a long shot. The damage is severe." Keanu knelt beside the doctor, looking over his shoulder. "We don't have a choice. We need to at least try." The doctor nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. Keanu stood up and looked around at the survivors. They had managed to get a small fire going, and some of the others were working on gathering food and water. They were resourceful, even in the face of disaster. Keanu knew the doctor was right. They were in the middle of nowhere, and the crash had taken out most of the plane's electronics. But they had to try. The only thing they could do now was stay alive long enough to get rescued. "All right, listen up," Keanu called out to the group. "We're going to stay here and make sure everyone is safe. The doctor and I are going to try to get a signal out, but we need everyone else to stay alert. If you see anything, any sign of help, we move, understood?" The survivors nodded in agreement, their eyes filled with a mix of determination and fear. Keanu knew they were all scared. He was too. But they had to pull together if they were going to survive this. The doctor looked up from the wreckage. "I think I've got something. It's weak, but it might work." Keanu moved over to where the doctor was working, peering over his shoulder. The radio was sparking with intermittent static, but there was a signal. "It's something. We'll keep trying." Keanu's voice was steady, though the tension was thick in the air. "Can you hear me?" the doctor called out into the radio, hoping against hope that there was someone on the other end. For a few moments, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, through the crackle of interference, a voice. Can you repeat your location?" The voice was distant, but it was there. It was a faint glimmer of hope in a sea of despair. The doctor's hands moved quickly, adjusting the dial on the radio to try and improve the signal. "This is Dr. Ross. We've crashed in the woods. We need immediate rescue." Keanu could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the breakthrough they needed. The voice on the other end of the line crackled once more, but it was clear this time. "Dr. Ross, we read you. Are there survivors? What is your location?" The doctor glanced up at Keanu, who nodded. They had to be as detailed as possible. "We have survivors. The crash site is located approximately 15 miles west of." The doctor began to give the coordinates, trying to stay calm. Keanu watched, his mind racing as the doctor continued. This was their lifeline, their chance at survival. If they didn't get this right, they could be waiting for days, or worse. "Understood. We are sending help immediately. Stay in place. Keep the fire going." The voice on the radio was reassuring, but Keanu knew they still had a long road ahead. "Thank you. Please hurry," the doctor responded, his voice filled with urgency. Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They had done it. They had gotten through. Now they just had to wait. But even as he felt the relief wash over him, Keanu knew it wasn't over. They had to stay alert. They had to make sure the survivors were comfortable, that the fire kept burning, and that everyone stayed calm. "All right, everyone, we've made contact, but we're not out of this yet." Keanu's voice was firm, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Stay focused, stay safe. If anyone feels sick or injured, let me know. We're in this together." The survivors nodded, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear, but also a glimmer of hope. They had come through the worst, and now, with the promise of help on the way, they could hold on a little longer. Keanu turned back to the doctor, who was working to fix the radio and keep the line open. He knew the doctor was doing everything he could, but they had to stay vigilant. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air seemed to ease, just a little. The survivors began to settle down around the fire, their faces haggard but hopeful. Keanu walked over to the woman they had saved earlier, checking her pulse once more. She was breathing, her condition stable for the moment. But there was still so much left to do. The wreckage needed to be sorted through for supplies, and the survivors had to be kept warm. The forest around them was quiet, but Keanu knew it was only a matter of time before the next challenge came. Hours passed, the sun slowly beginning to set, casting long shadows over the wreckage. Keanu kept a watchful eye on the survivors, staying close to the doctor as he worked to keep the radio signal steady. There was still no word from the rescue team, but Keanu wasn't about to give up hope. They had come this far, and they weren't about to give in now. As the hours passed, the air grew colder, and the survivors huddled together for warmth. The fire crackled, sending flickers of light dancing over their tired faces. Keanu sat by the fire, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The wreckage was quiet now, the flames from the crash reduced to smoldering embers, but he knew they had to stay vigilant. The doctor worked tirelessly at the radio, adjusting the dials and trying to boost the signal. He was focused, his brow furrowed in concentration, but Keanu could see the strain in his eyes. They were both running on adrenaline, but the reality was settling in. They were still far from safety. Keanu stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. He needed to keep moving, to stay alert. The crash had shaken them all to their core, but they couldn't afford to lose their focus now. "Anything?" Keanu asked, walking over to the doctor. The doctor shook his head, his fingers moving rapidly over the controls. "Still trying. The signal's weak, but we haven't lost contact yet." He paused for a moment, glancing up at Keanu. "How are the others doing?" Keanu looked around at the survivors. Most of them were sitting quietly, some staring into the fire, others talking in low voices. A few had fallen asleep, exhaustion taking its toll. But there was still a sense of hope among them. They had made it through the worst, and now they just had to hold on a little longer. They're holding up. We've got food and water, and the fire's still going. They're managing, but it's not going to be easy for much longer. Keanu's voice was steady, but the weight of the situation was never far from his mind. We need to keep spirits up. It's going to be a long wait. The doctor nodded, his expression thoughtful. You're right. The longer we wait, the harder it's going to get. But we have to keep fighting. Keanu turned to look at the wreckage again. They had managed to secure the area around the crash site, but the forest beyond was still uncharted. They couldn't take any chances. He knew they had to keep an eye out for wildlife, but the sound of the occasional rustle in the trees only served to heighten the tension. Every noise seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. What do you think the chances are that we'll get rescued tonight? Keanu asked, his voice low. He didn't expect a clear answer, but it was a question that had been weighing on him for hours. The doctor sighed, wiping his brow. It's hard to say. The crash site is isolated, and the radio is giving us a weak signal at best. But as long as we keep trying, there's always hope. Keanu didn't say anything. He knew the doctor was doing everything he could, but the uncertainty was hard to shake. They needed to hold on to that hope, no matter how slim the chances seemed. The survivors had settled into a somber routine. They took turns keeping watch, making sure the fire never went out. The doctor continued to work on the radio, his face etched with determination. Keanu remained close by, offering reassurance when needed, but there was only so much he could do. He had to stay strong for them, even when his own mind was filled with doubt. As the night wore on, the cold began to seep in, and Keanu could feel the chill creeping into his bones. He pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, glancing around the circle of survivors. Most of them were either asleep or trying to rest, but he could see the fear in their eyes. They were holding on to the hope that rescue was imminent, but the longer they waited, the more that hope began to fade. Then, just as the darkness seemed to settle in fully, the crackling of the radio broke the silence. This is Alpha Rescue Team. We've received your distress signal. Hold tight. We're coming for you. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. Keanu's heart leapt in his chest. Did you hear that? He turned to the doctor, who had a look of disbelief on his face. We're not imagining this, right? The doctor said, his hands trembling as he adjusted the radio controls. Keanu nodded, his heart pounding. No, we're not imagining it. They're coming for us. The relief that washed over him was almost overwhelming. The survivors stirred, and a few of them lifted their heads in confusion. But Keanu didn't care. They had been heard. They were going to make it. Everyone listen up. Keanu called out, his voice loud and clear. Help is on the way. They've received our signal. We just need to hang on a little longer. A wave of hope spread through the group. People began to sit up straighter, some smiling for the first time since the crash. The weight of the situation wasn't over, but now they knew they wouldn't be left to fend for themselves. They weren't alone. The doctor let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Thank God. He stood up and walked over to Keanu. You did it. You kept everyone together. Keanu shook his head, his expression serious. We did it. We all did. But it's not over yet. He turned to look at the group of survivors, his voice firm. We need to stay focused. There are still things we need to do. The survivors nodded, their faces brightening as they realized they were going to make it through. The fire crackled in the background, casting a warm glow on the group as they began to prepare for the final leg of their journey. Keanu's gaze moved to the forest beyond the wreckage. The rescue team would be here soon, but they weren't safe yet. The wilderness still held its dangers, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. But for the first time in hours, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had made it through the worst, and now all they had to do was hold on a little longer. The rescue team was on their way, and they were going to survive. The wind had picked up as the hours dragged on, but Keanu's focus never wavered. He stood by the fire, scanning the dark horizon, eyes alert for any sign of the rescue team. The others had settled in as best as they could, but the weight of the unknown still hung in the air. The radio had gone quiet again. There was no more communication, and though they'd been told help was on the way, The silence now felt deafening. Every rustle in the trees made Keanu's heart skip a beat. Was it them? Or was it something more dangerous? He forced himself to take a slow breath. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself. "We're almost there." His thoughts were interrupted by a low voice behind him. "Keanu." He turned to see the doctor standing a few feet away, a worried expression on his face. "I've checked the signal again. I think we're losing it. It's becoming weaker." Keanu's jaw tightened. "How much longer do we have?" "I don't know," the doctor replied, his voice filled with frustration. "It's hard to say. I don't think we can rely on this anymore. We'll just have to hope." That word had become a lifeline over the past few hours, and Keanu didn't want to let it go, but the doctor's words hit him hard. They couldn't rely on hope alone. They needed real, tangible action. Keanu walked back toward the fire, surveying the survivors. Some of them were still sitting quietly, their eyes distant, while others had started to take action. 2 of the older survivors were gathering more firewood, and a few of the younger ones were checking on the injured. But Keanu knew they needed more. He needed to do more. He walked over to a group of survivors huddled together, making sure they had enough warmth. "Stay close to the fire," he told them, "and keep your spirits up. Help is on the way." The survivors gave him grateful smiles, but Keanu could see the exhaustion and fear in their eyes. They weren't so much clinging to hope anymore as they were clinging to him. He had been their rock for hours, and now, as the cold night pressed in on them, he felt the weight of that responsibility more than ever. He turned and looked back at the wreckage. The once mighty plane, now reduced to twisted metal and shattered glass, stood as a grim reminder of how close they had come to the edge of oblivion. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the trees, making Keanu's heart race. His eyes darted to the source of the sound. Had someone entered the area? His pulse quickened. He moved swiftly, walking toward the edge of the wreckage, ready for anything. "Keanu," the doctor called out, his voice shaking. "What's happening?" Keanu held up a hand, signaling for silence. He crept closer to the edge, straining his ears. Another crack echoed in the distance. A branch snapping? Or was it something far worse? "Stay quiet," Keanu whispered sharply to the group, who had gathered around the fire once again. They fell silent, eyes wide as they watched him move with precision. The sound came again, this time much closer. Keanu's instincts kicked in. He had faced danger before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a matter of surviving a plane crash. This was about keeping the entire group alive in a place where every sound, every movement, felt like it could be a threat. Keanu moved closer, his hand on the handle of a small hunting knife that he had found in the wreckage. The crash had scattered so many supplies, but there were always a few things that survived, things that could make all the difference. The forest around him was eerily still. No animals, no birds, just the low hum of the wind. Keanu slowed his breathing, trying to blend into the shadows of the wreckage, scanning the trees for movement. And then, just as his hand tightened on the hilt of the knife, he saw it, a shadow moving through the trees. It wasn't human. At least, not in the way they would expect. Keanu's heart skipped. He knew what it was, a wild animal, something large. The forest had its dangers, but he hadn't expected this. Not now. "Get ready," Keanu hissed, his voice low but sharp as he backed toward the survivors, signaling for them to prepare. The others heard the urgency in his voice and scrambled into action, some grabbing rocks, others grabbing sticks. Everyone had been through a lot, but the fear that this moment brought was something they hadn't fully prepared for. Keanu quickly ran back to the doctor. "We're not alone. We've got company," he said, his voice steady but low, trying to keep the panic at bay. "Get the survivors ready. If it comes to it, we'll have to defend ourselves." The doctor's eyes widened, but he nodded quickly. "Understood. I'll get them ready." Keanu moved forward again, his feet crunching lightly on the forest floor, trying to make as little noise as possible. He could see the shape now, bigger than he had expected. The wild animal was closing in, and he had no way of knowing if there were more. The sound of heavy breathing reached his ears, and Keanu's stomach churned. There was no mistaking it now. Whatever it was getting closer. His mind raced. Could he drive it off? Could he scare it away? Suddenly, a figure appeared, a tall, dark silhouette that stepped from behind the trees. Keanu's heart sank. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, moving slowly, deliberately. A man with a deep-set expression. Keanu froze, a chill running down his spine. This wasn't the threat he had anticipated, but it was no less dangerous. The man in front of him was armed. Without a second thought, Keanu ran toward him, pulling out the knife in his hand. He moved quickly, avoiding the trees and the underbrush as he approached. He was ready for a fight, ready to protect his people no matter what. The man turned, eyes narrowing as he saw Keanu coming toward him. There was no hesitation. They both knew the stakes. The man raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Keanu, his finger hovering near the trigger. But Keanu wasn't about to back down. "Who are you?" Keanu demanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through him. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he tightened his grip on the rifle. Keanu's knife was ready. The standoff was imminent. The standoff between Keanu and the stranger lingered in the thick silence. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified now, the rustling of the leaves, the distant crackling of the dying embers from the wreckage. The air felt heavy with tension, and Keanu's eyes never left the man's. There was a calmness in the stranger's eyes, but Keanu could see the calculation behind them. This wasn't someone who was just lost in the woods. This was someone who had a purpose. "Who are you?" Keanu repeated, his voice unwavering. His body was coiled, ready for any sudden movements, his grip tight on the hunting knife, but his instincts told him that rushing into a fight could be disastrous. They needed to know who they were dealing with first. The man finally spoke, his voice deep, laced with a calm but commanding tone. "I could ask you the same question. But that's not important right now." Keanu's eyes narrowed. This wasn't the answer he was expecting. But the stranger didn't move, nor did he lower the rifle. Instead, he slowly circled, maintaining a defensive position. Keanu took a step back, his mind racing. He had no way of knowing if this was a friend or foe, but the fact that the stranger was armed made him wary. The question on his mind was simple. What did this person want with them? "Look, we don't want trouble. We're just trying to survive." Keanu's tone softened, attempting to find common ground, but his hand remained ready by his side. "We've already been through hell. We're survivors of a crash, and we're just trying to get out of here." The stranger's gaze didn't soften, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition? Pity? Keanu wasn't sure. The man finally lowered the rifle, but it was still slung over his shoulder. "A plane crash?" the stranger said, his voice not without a hint of curiosity. "That's not good. Not good at all. But you're not the first to find yourself in this mess." Keanu felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What do you mean?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees as if he was expecting something. Keanu took another step back, motioning for the others to stay inside the wreckage. The last thing they needed was for the stranger to see their numbers. Finally, the stranger spoke again, his voice almost a whisper. "There's a lot more going on in these woods than you think. People who crash don't always make it out, and they don't always get help." Keanu's mind was spinning. This wasn't just some random survivalist, was it? The implication of the stranger's words hung in the air, and it made Keanu uneasy. "Who are you really?" he asked again, his voice firm. The stranger paused, then took a long, deliberate breath. "I'm just someone who's trying to make it through. Just like you." His tone was blunt, but there was something beneath it, an edge to his words that made Keanu feel like there was more to this than the man was letting on. Keanu wasn't buying it. This man wasn't just a wanderer. He wasn't a survivor. There was something deeper at play. "Why are you out here? Who are you really with?" The stranger's eyes darted to the wreckage once more, his gaze softening for just a moment. "I'm not with anyone. I'm here alone. But that doesn't mean you're safe." He paused again, as if weighing his next words carefully. "You do well to remember that in these woods, it's not just the wilderness you need to worry about." Keanu took a step closer, but his posture remained tense, ready for anything. The others were watching from behind the wreckage, their faces full of questions, but they stayed out of sight. "What are you trying to tell me?" Keanu asked, his patience thinning. The stranger looked at him for a long moment, as if measuring whether or not to reveal more. "There's a network of people out here, people who don't take kindly to newcomers. You found yourselves in the middle of something that goes far beyond a crash. These woods are dangerous." Keanu felt his heart rate increase. Was he talking about bandits? People who preyed on those stranded in the wild? "What do you mean?" Keanu asked again, his mind whirling with possibilities. The stranger's lips curled into a wry smile. "You'll find out soon enough. Just make sure you're ready. Because not everyone out here is as friendly as I am." Keanu's hand tightened on the hunting knife, and his instincts screamed that the stranger was hiding something. This man was too knowledgeable, too prepared to be just another survivor. There was something he wasn't telling them, something important. Before Keanu could respond, the stranger raised his hand, signaling for silence. "I don't have time to explain." His eyes flitted to the edge of the trees, and Keanu felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "What's happening?" Keanu asked, his voice a low growl. "What are you looking at?" The stranger's eyes flicked back to him. "Get ready. This isn't over yet." Before Keanu could react, there was a rustling sound behind him, and he spun around, his body tensed, every muscle ready to spring into action. The group of survivors was still huddled by the fire, but now they were looking up, alarmed. Keanu's eyes darted from one to the other, but he couldn't figure out what had made them all so uneasy. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Keanu saw it. A figure, a silhouette, moving quickly between the trees. No noise, no announcement. Just the unsettling presence of someone, or something, closing in. "Get back to the wreckage!" Keanu shouted, pushing the survivors into motion. The stranger's face had gone stone-cold serious as he scanned the area, his hand moving back to the rifle on his shoulder. Keanu took one last look at the man. His gut told him that this stranger knew more than he was letting on, and the danger was closing in fast. The survivors scrambled toward the wreckage, keeping low and moving quickly. But Keanu stayed put, keeping his eyes on the approaching figure. He had a bad feeling about this. The forest around them was no longer just a place of refuge. It was a battleground. And as the shadows grew longer and the air colder, Keanu knew the real fight was just beginning. The tension in the air grew thick, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Keanu's instincts screamed that the danger was close. His eyes never left the shadowy figure moving quickly between the trees. The figure was too fast, too silent, and Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random encounter. There was something about the way the stranger had acted, the way he had warned them. The survivors huddled behind the wreckage, their eyes wide with fear as they whispered among themselves. Keanu took a deep breath, his grip on the knife tightening. His mind raced. What was the stranger hiding? And what did he know about the danger closing in on them? "Get ready," Keanu muttered under his breath, his voice a low growl. The others, though nervous, trusted him. They had no choice but to follow his lead. The figure had stopped moving, now blending into the shadows of the trees. Keanu crouched low, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. His heart raced, his senses sharp, every muscle in his body coiled with anticipation. Suddenly, the figure emerged from the trees, faster than Keanu expected, closer than he'd imagined. It was a man, his face obscured by a dark mask, but his posture gave him away. This wasn't an ordinary person. This was someone trained, someone dangerous. Without thinking, Keanu surged forward, moving with the speed and precision of a predator. He had no time to waste. The man raised a weapon, a large crossbow, and aimed it at Keanu. The bolt shot out, the metal tip glinting in the fading light. Keanu dodged just in time, the bolt missing him by mere inches. He didn't hesitate. With one swift movement, he launched himself at the attacker, using his momentum to disarm the man and send him crashing to the ground. The stranger scrambled to regain his footing, but Keanu was already on top of him, pinning him to the ground with ease. He had trained for situations like this, and years of combat had honed his skills. He knew how to handle himself in moments of extreme danger. The man beneath him struggled, but Keanu kept him restrained, pressing down on his chest with the weight of his body. "Who are you?" What do you want? Keanu demanded, his voice low and controlled, but filled with urgency. The stranger, gasping for air, met Keanu's eyes with defiance. You wouldn't understand. Keanu tightened his grip, a warning. Try me. The man's eyes flicked to the side, and Keanu followed his gaze, but there was nothing there. The man seemed to be waiting for something, his body tense, as if he was expecting reinforcements. Keanu's mind raced. Was this part of a bigger operation? Had they been ambushed by more than just one attacker? He looked over his shoulder, scanning the surroundings, but everything appeared still, quiet. The silence only deepened his suspicion. He wasn't alone in this fight, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. The stranger's breathing steadied, and his expression softened just a fraction. You're not going to get out of here alive. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. The words echoed in his mind, heavy with meaning. What was the stranger talking about? Were they all doomed? The survivor's voice trembled from behind the wreckage. Keanu, what's happening? Keanu didn't take his eyes off the stranger, but he called back to them. Stay down. Stay behind cover. He could feel the stranger shifting beneath him, trying to break free. With a swift movement, Keanu grabbed the man's collar, pulling him closer. Who are you working for? What's going on here? The stranger smirked, as if he were amused by Keanu's persistence. You'll find out soon enough. Keanu's eyes narrowed. He knew there was more to this, but he couldn't afford to waste time. Every second counted. Answer me, Keanu growled, his patience running thin. The man exhaled sharply. There's a reason you're here. This is no accident. You're part of a much bigger picture than you realize. Keanu's mind raced as he processed the stranger's cryptic words. What are you talking about? Before the stranger could respond, the faint sound of footsteps reached Keanu's ears. More people. Reinforcements. We've got company, Keanu muttered under his breath. The stranger's expression flickered. He knew what that meant. Keanu reacted without thinking. With one swift motion, he grabbed the man's arm and yanked him up to his feet, forcing him to move toward the wreckage with Keanu keeping a firm hold on him. Move! Keanu barked. Now! The stranger struggled, but Keanu's grip was unrelenting. The man was strong, but not strong enough to break free. As they approached the wreckage, Keanu spotted the survivors still huddled behind it. They looked terrified, unsure of what was coming next. Get ready, Keanu called to them, his voice sharp. We've got more company. Stay down, stay quiet, and be ready to move fast. The stranger looked back at him, eyes filled with anger. You can't fight them all. You'll die here just like the others. Keanu didn't respond, focusing on the task at hand. They were running out of time, and the odds were stacked against them. But he wasn't about to let them all fall without a fight. The sound of more footsteps echoed through the trees. This time, they were closer. Keanu's heart raced, but his mind was sharp. He turned back to the stranger, who had stopped struggling, sensing the tension. You've been warned, the stranger said, almost as if he were trying to warn Keanu. I'm not the real enemy. Keanu's grip tightened. He had no intention of backing down. Then who is? The man smirked again, as if amused by Keanu's persistence. You'll see soon enough. Just remember, nothing here is what it seems. Before Keanu could respond, a loud roar filled the air. It was a sound unlike anything Keanu had ever heard. His heart skipped a beat, his senses heightening as he spun around to face the noise. The figure had said something about danger, but now it was clear what he meant. The forest was no longer a safe place. As Keanu stood frozen, the noise grew louder, the air thick with the anticipation of something terrible, something approaching. The stranger's eyes widened in fear, his earlier bravado fading. He had been right all along. This wasn't a fight they were prepared for.